Hello, welcome to Dot Point's PS21 and PS22. So both of these are relating to supply and demand. And first of all, we have to describe factors that affect supply and demand for beef. And then we also need to interpret supply and demand information that we might be given on a graph. So let's begin. This is a combined supply and demand curve on the same graph. And it shows in the middle here, which I've marked as red, what's called the equilibrium market price. And we'll look at this in a second, but basically you've got your demand curve or demand line here, and you've got your supply line here. And they conflict with each other because when prices are high, producers wish to sell a lot and make a lot of the product. But at the same time, when prices are high, consumers don't wish to buy as much. The demand is reduced because they don't like to pay as much. So these two things conflict with each other. And when they meet in the middle, we get what's called an equilibrium market price, where basically the amount of supply is the same as the amount of demand for a product, and that's ideal. But obviously with things like beef that take years and years to produce, it kind of fluctuates around the equilibrium price. It's not perfect all the time. But let's have a look first at demand and supply separately. So demand is basically how much beef people want. So market demand for any single commodity referred as collective buying power of consumers. And so a relationship exists between different market prices and the amount of beef or quantity of the product that people want. So if we have a look here, this is the demand curve or the demand line here on a graph. And basically when the market price is higher, if you draw a line here and then you go down to demand, to the quantity, when the market price is relatively high, as it is in X, consumers don't want that much. But if the market price for beef dropped and it became $10 a kilo instead of $20 a kilo, then you extrapolate out that information and the quantity demanded by consumers is much higher at B here. And so basically this is the demand curve. It's showing what you already know, that when the price is higher, people want less of it. When the price is lower, people want more of it. So that is exactly what this curve is showing at X and Y. Price high, less demand. Price low, more demand from consumers. And that is called the demand curve. And so it shows the law of demand, which means, as I said, the lower the prices, the more people want of it. In terms of factors that affect demand, now we need to not confuse demand and supply. You can't say that supply affects demand in this example because we're talking about things that purely affect demand. So things such as advertising, past experience, price of alternatives, and the time of year all affect demand. So advertising, if there's an ad on TV for beef and it talks about the health benefits of iron, etc., it could convince consumers to buy more, and it generally increases demand. In terms of past experience, if people have recently had a piece of beef and it wasn't very good, it might have been tough or dry or wasn't cooked very well, this might mean they're going to choose something else and they might buy chicken instead, and this affects demand either positively or negatively, depending on whether it was good or not. The price of alternatives is also significant. So for example, these days chicken is very cheap. Chicken breasts you can easily get for $9 a kilo, sometimes less. And rump beef, which is kind of not the best piece, but it's still okay, of beef is $20 a kilo. So it's more than double to get beef. So this fact reduces the demand for beef because people are going to tend to buy chicken if they're worried about money, or they just need to buy a larger amount of food for a lower price, then they're going to buy chicken instead of beef. So the price of alternatives does affect demand. Also, the time of year affects demand. So as you'd probably know, people buy different cuts of meat at different times of year. So for example, in winter, people tend to like stew beef and make stews and various other things like that. So they use tougher, lower quality cuts of beef that can be cooked for longer. But in summer, people use things like sausages, steaks on the barbecue, obviously, because it's the weather for having barbecue, and this affects demand. So the change in demand for different cuts in particular changes throughout the year. Moving on to supply. So basically the supply is how much beef is available or how much beef is being produced by producers, by farmers. And so It's the collective amount brought to market by producers. And so this is what we call the law of supply. And it's basically the opposite. The curve or the line you can see goes through here. And it's the opposite direction to the demand curve. Now, basically, in terms of supply, when the market price is high, if you draw the line across and down, producers want to supply more, because if they're growing beef and the price is really high, that's the time when they're going to want to sell it. And so the quantity being sold by producers or being supplied is higher when the price is high. And this, of course, conflicts with what we said with consumers, because consumers, when the price is high, don't want to buy as much. And so you can see this might lead to a point where if the price is high, there might be an oversupply and there's more animals being supplied to the market than people are willing to pay for. And that then in turn makes the price drop. However, if the market price is really low, so whatever it might be is, let's say it's half the market price of X at Y, and then producers are going to want to produce less because they're obviously not going to try and sell their cattle when the prices at market are low. So when prices are high, producers want to supply more, and at Y, when prices are low, producers want to supply less. That's pretty basic, I think. So in terms of things that affect supply, just things to do that affect supply, not relating too much to demand. So disease, if there's an outbreak of disease, obviously that's going to limit the supply of beef cattle on the market. If there's a drought or flood, so climatic events, will reduce the pasture available, reduce the feed, increase the price of grain, and that is going to reduce the amount of beef that is supplied to the market. Now, on this front, the Australian dollar, if the Australian dollar drops in value against, say, the US dollar, then what that means is it's going to be much cheaper for people in the US and other places to buy Australian beef. So if the Australian dollar drops significantly, Australian beef will, a lot of it will get exported overseas because it will be cheaper for people overseas, and so that reduces supply in Australia. The last one here is the price of feed. So if usually related to this drought one here, but if the price of grain goes up, less cattle will be able to be fed and hence decreasing supply. Now, this is an important point here. Equilibrium price. Often you've been asked in past questions where the equilibrium price is. Where the supply and demand curve interact or intersect, this is where the equilibrium price is here. And that's because this is where the right amount is being supplied for how much is demanded by consumers. And basically, farmers are happy to supply it at that price and consumers are happy to buy it at that price. And that's called equilibrium market price. Now, we've got two other examples here, X and Y. Now, at X, if you've got a high market price, the demand for the product is going to be low. Because as we already said, consumers don't like to buy things at high prices. So if the price up here is high compared to Y, X is higher, demand is going to be low. The quantity of demand is going to be low. But if we keep going across to the supply curve, farmers are going to want to supply it when we have a high price at X. So you have this difference between these two lines that are red, and we call that oversupply because the producers are supplying more than the consumers want, and that's called oversupply. And that's going to mean the price, even though the price is high here now, it's going to lead to the price dropping over time. On the other hand, if we have a low price in the market, which is example here is X, the supply is going to be low because producers don't want to sell their cattle at a low price. So the supply is going to be low at the green line here. But if you move across to the demand curve, because these two things are switched over, the demand curve is going to be high here. So there's going to be high demand at a low price in the market, which we've already talked about. And so this is where we have less supply. People want lots of it. It's what we call an undersupply. And so eventually that's going to force the price to go up. So you can see that the price is kind of always moving towards this, or usually, not always, but it tends to move towards an equilibrium price where consumers and producers are satisfied. So X is where the price is high, demand is low, supply is high, leading to oversupply. And Y is where the price is lower, demand is higher over here, supply is low, and therefore you have an undersupply. So past HSC questions, this one's asking for which point shows the equilibrium market price, and clearly that's X because equilibrium market price is here, so it is X. This question is quite a good one from 2012. It says, this graph shows the fluctuation in price of agricultural commodity over 5 years. I've marked off the years here. You can see that in each year, there's just normal seasonal fluctuation of the commodity. So, I mean, this could be, for example, mangoes. And you know that mangoes increase in price at certain times of the year. This is probably increasing at the wrong time of the year because mangoes drop in price at the end of the year. But basically things fluctuate, the price of things go up and down throughout the year because of just normal seasonal conditions, because some things like mangoes, for example, become ripe at a certain time of the year, so there's lots of them and the price will drop. And so these two first years already account for normal seasonal fluctuations. However, you can see clearly here in year 3 there's a significant deviation where the price has significantly increased. So what is the reason for that? Importing more of the commodity. If we import more, there's more supply, and that means that the price will actually drop here because there's more supply, and when you put more supply onto the market, the price will drop. So that's not correct. Unseasonal weather conditions in a major production area. That's possible because these are normal seasonal weather conditions here. This would be unseasonal. It'd be unusual weather condition. And if we lost lots of the crop or whatever it is, beef, cattle, if there was problems, the price would go up because there'd be less of it available. So B is definitely possible. Normal seasonal variation is not true because we already can see that in here. And this is clearly different to that. And then a significant reduction in demand. If demand drops, then the price is also going to drop because there'll be more available and less people wanting to buy it. So the only answer there is B. This one shows a supply and demand curve on a graph, and you need to interpret that information. And so supply and demand curve for products is shown. What is the outcome of shift from supply 1 to supply 2? So if you draw it out here, green is where it is initially, and red is where it ends up once you move to supply 2. And so basically what's happening is when we move from green to red, there's a quantity is decreasing, but the price is increasing. So the only option here really that fits it is there would be an increase in price for the product. The price would remain unchanged is wrong. There'd be a bit decrease in price is wrong. Supply quantity and price would remain the same is also wrong. This question from 2015 says, describe factors affecting the supply of and demand for this product. Now, you need to describe them well, and I have very clearly indicated which bit's supply and which bit is demand. You need to talk about each of them individually and really do not mix them up because it's not asking you to mix them together. You need to really clearly show the difference. So I've given factors and I've made it really clear what the factors are. I've given disease and pests and the Australian dollar for supply, and for demand, I've said advertising and past experience. And then I've clearly showed in each one whether it reduces supply, decreases demand, etc., increases demand. So I've described in detail the factors that affect supply and demand clearly here for 4 marks. And it's really good. You really need to set it out like this so the markers can just see the marks straight away. The last page of questions here, 2016, which graph accurately shows the demand curve for agricultural products? So you could draw out different spots here. You could draw lines to work out what would happen. But basically, when the quantity is low, the price is higher. And when the quantity is higher, the price is lower. So that is a demand curve for the product. So that's A. And the last question here, explain how an increase in demand for a farm product may affect financial decisions. So I've talked about an increase in the price of beef, in the demand of beef, would likely to cause a farmer to increase production due to high prices as the market seeks to head towards equilibrium market price. And it might lead them in terms of financial decisions, taking on more debt, allowing them to invest in new land and machinery and labor, etc. And that will help them increase production. And so hopefully, if there's sufficient demand to meet the increased supply, they'll get a better price, and they'll also have to manage the increased debt and interest repayments on their increased property.